You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Hello, true crime fans, and welcome back to the True Crime Never Sleeps show. As always, I'm your host, Larry Lease. And of course, on this week, being the end of the week, we dive into shit out of luck. And this week, we're diving into the railway killer and how he was eventually captured and brought to justice. Before we do that, give me your thoughts on this case, of course, in the comment section below. And if you have another episode you want covered for Shit Out of Luck, or Let's Talk, or any other episodes, let me know. And now let's dive right in. In the annals of American true crime, there are a few names as haunting as Ángel Reséndiz, better known as the Railway Killer. For more than a decade, he moved like a phantom across state lines, hitching rides on freight trains, sneaking into quiet neighborhoods, and leaving behind bodies in his wake. His murders stretched from Texas to Illinois, from Kentucky to Florida, and possibly even beyond American borders. By the time he was finally apprehended in July of 1999, his name had become synonymous with fear. Entire communities near train tracks locked their doors at night and lived in the shadow of a man who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, strike with savage violence, and vanish again onto the rails. But who was Ángel Reséndiz? How did a poor boy from Mexico become one of America's most elusive serial killers? And what chain of events finally brought his reign of terror to an end? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Ángel Reséndiz was born on August 1st, 1959 in Puebla, Mexico. His childhood was defined by instability. Accounts from relatives and acquaintances suggest a turbulent upbringing, marked by poverty, limited education, and exposure to violence at a young age. Like many impoverished children in rural Mexico at the time, Ángel grew up with a little opportunity for advancement. By his teenage years, he had already developed a reputation as a drifter. He never put down roots, never stayed in one place for long. Instead, he found freedom in movement. He rode buses, walked long distances, and eventually discovered the lifeline that would define his adult life: freight trains. Trains offered more than transportation. They provided anonymity, a means to cross vast distances without documentation, and eventually the foundation for his crimes. In interviews after his capture, Ángel described himself almost romantically as a traveler of the rails. But beneath this drifter's image lay something darker. Reséndiz's criminal record began long before his name was tied to murder. He was arrested multiple times for burglary, trespassing, and immigration violations, both in the United States and in Mexico. Each time he managed to slip through the cracks. Deportations became routine. Law enforcement would catch him for minor crimes, realize he was undocumented, and send him back to Mexico. But Reséndiz never stayed. Like clockwork, he'd reappear in the United States, hopping onto a freight train headed north, vanishing into the maze of American railroads. This cycle of arrest, deportation, and re-entry would repeat itself for years, setting the stage for the far graver crimes he would eventually commit. Reséndiz's first confirmed murder on U.S. soil occurred in 1986. His victim was Christopher Mayer, a 21-year-old University of Kentucky student. Christopher and his girlfriend were walking along the railroad tracks near Lexington when they were attacked. Christopher was beaten to death, and his girlfriend was brutally assaulted, though she survived the attack. This murder bore the hallmarks of what would later become Reséndiz's signature: crime committed near the railroad. Impulsive, yet brutally efficient, and motivated less by profit than by rage and domination. The case shocked the local community, but investigators at the time had no idea it was the beginning of something larger. Without DNA databases and with limited interstate coordination, the crime was filed as a tragic but isolated incident. Reséndiz, meanwhile, vanished onto the rails. Over the following years, more victims began to surface, but because the murders were spread across multiple states, no one was able to piece together that a single killer was responsible. As the years passed, Reséndiz refined his methods. He targeted homes that sat close to train tracks, places where his approach and escape could be swift and unnoticed. Once inside, he relied on blunt force trauma, hammers, pipes, rocks, or whatever weapon was readily available. Unlike many serial killers, Reséndiz didn't always kill for sexual gratification, though rape was present in some cases. Often it seemed the murders themselves were acts of opportunity, a way to control, dominate, and remove obstacles while he drifted through another community. After committing a murder, Reséndiz displayed chilling composure. In some cases, he lingered in his victims' homes, eating their food, sleeping in their beds, even watching television. Then, when he was ready, he would slip back onto the rails and disappear into the night. This pattern made him exceptionally difficult to catch. Without a clear motive and without targeting a specific demographic, his crimes appeared random to law enforcement. The victims ranged from young women to elderly couples, making profiling near impossible in the early years. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, Reséndiz's trail of violence expanded. Authorities now believe he may have been responsible for murders in Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Illinois, and possibly even outside the U.S. But it wasn't until the 90s that his crime began to draw national attention. In 1997, 98, and 99, the number of confirmed victims escalated. Each case bore the same unsettling signs: proximity to railroad tracks, brutal bludgeoning, and a killer who seemed to appear and vanish at will. By the late 90s, law enforcement agencies were forced to confront the terrifying possibility they weren't dealing with isolated murders. They were facing a serial killer who was using America's railway system as his hunting ground. For communities near train lines, the atmosphere changed. Stories of murders began to circulate in small towns and cities where freight trains passed quietly through the night. Parents told their children to stay away from the tracks. Homeowners near railroads began installing extra locks and security lights. In towns where murders had occurred, residents described the haunting sound of trains at night as a reminder of the killer who might still be lurking in the shadows. The randomness of the attacks was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Victims weren't chosen because of grudges or wealth. They were chosen because they lived near the rails. That meant anyone who fit that description could be next. By 1999, the fear was no longer localized. It had become a national concern. Law enforcement across multiple states were racing to connect the dots. But Reséndiz remained one step ahead, carried by the very trains that defined him. The stage was set for one of the most intense manhunts of the 90s. Law enforcement agencies working with the FBI would soon place Angel on the 10 most wanted list. But before his capture, the railway killer would claim more lives, escalate his violence, and ignite a media frenzy that spread fear across the nation. Behind every headline about the railway killer were lives cut short, families shattered, and communities left reeling. To understand the terror Reséndiz inflicted, it's important to look closely at some of his victims. Claudia Benton was a 39-year-old pediatric neurologist living in Houston, Texas. Known for her warmth and dedication to patients, Claudia lived in a home near the railroad tracks. On December 17, 1998, Angel broke into her house. He raped her, stabbed her, and bludgeoned her to death with a bronze statue. He then stole her car, driving it across state lines. Claudia's murder shocked Houston, not only because of its brutality, but because she was a respected doctor who had dedicated her life to helping others. Just months later, on May 2, 1999, Reséndiz struck again, this time in Weimar, Texas. His victims were Reverend Norman Simic and his wife, Karen. Norman was a beloved Methodist minister. Karen was active in their church community. The couple was beaten to death with a sledgehammer inside their parsonage home, once again located near railroad tracks. The crime scene horrified investigators. Bibles lay scattered in the blood, a stark reminder that even faith-filled lives were not spared his violence. On June 4th, 1999, he claimed another life, Noemi Dominguez, 26-year-old schoolteacher in Houston. Noemi had recently graduated from college and was just beginning her career. Her bright future was extinguished when Angel bludgeoned her to death in her home. He then stole her car, which was later found abandoned in Del Rio, Texas, near the Mexican border. Barely a week later, on June 15th, 1999, Reséndiz traveled north to Gorham, Illinois. There, he murdered George Morber, an 80-year-old man, and his daughter Josephine, who was 52. George was shot in the head, while Josephine was beaten to death. Their quiet rural home sat only yards from the train tracks. These murders were not only brutal, they were terrifyingly random. Young, old, rich, poor, none of it mattered. The only common denominator was proximity to the rails. By mid-1999, the killer's crimes had captured national attention. Media outlets across the country began reporting on the strange, terrifying pattern. CNN, ABC, local Texas stations ran nightly segments updating viewers on the investigation. The randomness of the attacks fueled widespread panic. News anchors described him as a phantom on the rails, a killer who could appear in any town with a train line. The phrase railway killer stuck, cementing his place in the public imagination. Communities near tracks responded with heightened fear. Homeowners added extra locks, bought guard dogs, and double-checked doors and windows each and every night. Rail yards reported increased trespassing patrols, but the vastness of the railway system made full control impossible. Freight trains rolled across the country every day, and the idea that a killer might be riding one of them made ordinary people feel vulnerable in ways they never had before. For law enforcement, the media coverage was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the public's awareness generated tips and heightened vigilance. On the other hand, created pressure to catch him quickly. In the constant spotlight, every failure was magnified. Reséndiz had crossed paths with police and immigration authorities multiple times before his eventual capture. He was arrested for burglary, trespassing, and immigration violations, and each time he was deported back to Mexico. But deportation was little more than an inconvenience for him. Within weeks, sometimes even days, he was back in the United States, hopping freight trains and vanishing into new communities. In hindsight, several missed opportunities stand out. In '98, shortly after Claudia's murder, police briefly had him in custody for a minor offense. But at that time, they didn't realize he was connected to the homicide. Without a national DNA database linking him to Claudia Benton's crime scene, he slipped away once again. These failures became points of frustration for investigators. The fragmented nature of American law enforcement, with local, state, and federal jurisdictions often failing to share information, created the perfect conditions for a transient killer to thrive. By June 1999, the situation had escalated to a breaking point. The murders of the Morbers, the Sirix, and Dominguez in such quick succession convinced authorities that they were dealing with an active, highly dangerous serial killer. The FBI officially placed Angel on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His photograph was circulated nationally. News broadcasts displayed his face during primetime hours. Wanted posters appeared at post offices, gas stations, and bus terminals. The FBI also released critical details about his MO. They warned the public that he traveled primarily by train, targeted homes near railroads, and was considered armed and extremely dangerous. The move to put him on the most wanted list dramatically increased public awareness. Tips began flooding in from across the country. Some claimed to have seen him in Texas, others in Florida, and still others as far north as Canada. The sheer number of leads reflected not only his mobility, but also the public's heightened sense of fear. By the summer of 1999, the railway killer had become one of the most wanted men in America. Law enforcement agencies were under immense pressure to bring him in. But what they didn't yet realize was that his capture wouldn't come through force. It wouldn't be a dramatic shootout on the rails or a surprise arrest in a freight yard. Instead, the breakthrough would come from the one place no one expected: his family. By the summer of 1999, Ángel Reséndiz was more than just a fugitive. He was a household name. His face appeared on television screens nightly, his nickname whispered in small towns across the country. The FBI considered him one of the most dangerous men in America. But despite the intense manhunt, Ángel still managed to elude capture. The turning point came not from law enforcement tactics, but from his sister, Manuela. Unlike her brother, she lived a quiet life, deeply religious, She struggled with the knowledge of his crimes and feared for his safety as much as for the safety of others. In her eyes, Angel was beyond redemption, but not beyond salvation. Law enforcement recognized her influence. FBI agents and Texas Rangers worked to convince her that if Reséndiz did not surrender, his end would almost certainly come violently. A shootout with police seemed inevitable. Manuela agreed. She began urging her brother to give himself up, framing it as an act of spiritual necessity, a way to save his soul, if not his life. Over time, her persistence broke through. Reséndiz agreed to surrender, but only if it could be done safely in the presence of his family. On July 13, 1999, the manhunt reached its climax. Manuela and her husband drove Reséndiz to the international bridge connecting Juarez, Mexico, to El Paso, Texas. Waiting there were FBI agents, Texas Rangers, and members of the U.S. Border Patrol. The scene was tense. Officers were prepared for violence, uncertain if the railway killer might change his mind at the last second or attempt to flee. But to the surprise of many, the surrender was quiet, even anticlimactic. Reséndiz stepped out of the car, raised his hands, and allowed himself to be taken into custody. After years of evasion, after more than a dozen murders, the railway killer was finally caught. It wasn't the dramatic shootout many had predicted. Instead, it was a surrender born of family persuasion, faith, and exhaustion. News of his capture spread quickly. Television anchors broke into regular programming, announcing the arrest. For communities living in fear, there was a sigh of relief. The phantom of the rails was behind bars. Once in custody, Reséndiz began to talk. He confessed to multiple murders across several states, often recounting them in chilling detail. His confessions linked him definitively to at least 15 murders, though investigators suspected there could be more. He described the attack on Claudia, detailing how he broke into her home, used a bronze statue to bludgeon her, and later drove away in her car. He admitted to the killings of Norman and Karen Siernik, recalling how he used a sledgehammer to end their lives in their church parsonage. He recounted the murder of Noemi Dominguez and explained how he fled south in her car. For investigators, these confessions provided closure on cases that had long troubled them. But the cold, detached way he spoke of the murders unsettled even seasoned detectives. There was no remorse, no empathy, only a matter-of-fact recounting of violence. In 2000, Angel Reséndiz went to trial for the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, the case prosecutors believed was their strongest. The evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found in her stolen car. DNA linked him to the crime scene. Witnesses recounted sightings of him near the railroad tracks leading to her home. The prosecution painted him as a remorseless predator who exploited the nation's railway system to kill at random. The defense, however, pursued a different strategy: insanity. They argued that Angel was mentally ill, incapable of fully understanding his actions. Psychiatrists testified that he suffered from delusions, including the belief that he was half man, half angel, chosen by God to cleanse the world of evil. Angel himself leaned into these claims. In interviews and during courtroom appearances, he insisted he was not truly human. He told the court he was, quote, an angel from God, and suggested that death would not harm him, as he would simply transform into another form. But the jury was unconvinced. The brutality of the crimes, the overwhelming forensic evidence, and his own detailed confessions outweighed the insanity defense. In 1999, he was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. Following his sentencing, Reséndiz was placed on death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. For years, he awaited execution while appeals wound their way through the court. During this time, he continued to make bizarre claims. He insisted that killing him would release demonic forces upon the earth. He spoke of visions and claimed to communicate directly with God. While his attorneys cited these statements as evidence of mental illness, prosecutors dismissed them as manipulative theatrics, an attempt to avoid accountability. On June 27, 2006, at the Huntsville unit in Texas, Angel Reséndiz, the railway killer, was led into the execution chamber. His final moments, his last words, and the impact of his death would mark the end of one of the most terrifying chapters in modern American crime. On the evening of June 27th, 2006, inside the Huntsville unit in Texas, Angel's story came to an end. At 8:05 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber, watched closely by prison officials, journalists, and family members of his victims. Witness reported that Angel appeared calm, even resigned. For a man who once claimed he was half angel and impervious to death, the moment carried a stark finality. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke softly, asking for forgiveness. He apologized to his victims' families, asked for God's mercy, and said he hoped his soul would find peace. At 8:17, lethal injection was administered. Moments later, the railway killer was pronounced dead. For years, he moved like a phantom across America's railways. He entered homes, destroyed lives, and vanished again into the night. But in the end, it wasn't the rails that carried him to freedom. It was his family who ended his reign, convincing him to face justice. The capture and execution of the railway killer marked the end of a nightmare. The echoes of his crimes remain etched in the communities he left behind. This has been the story of how Ángel Reséndiz was shit out of luck. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments section below. Give us a thumbs up if you like our video. Hit the subscribe button down below. Hit the bell notification button to be notified of future videos. And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, your support helps the channel grow, upgrade our equipment, bring in new hosts, be able to pay them, and of course, take this show on the road. We'd love to do live episodes from crime scenes across the country, and possibly one day even across the globe. And your support can help make that happen. Even if you give $1, $5, $20, $50, $100, anything you give is greatly appreciated. And you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.